I don't know, in settings like these, do we let people talk? Is there a good way, I guess if I repeat back, then we kind of capture for the distance audience? Okay. Because I'm not used to just standing up and lecturing. I'm used to kind of interacting a little bit more. So I'll do that as much as maybe we can, and if you have questions or comments or anything like that that you want to make, feel free to do that. Just, raise your hand or speak out or something, and I'll repeat it back. Most faculty members have had a chance to interact with our office. We work with last year it was a little under 1,800 students a year, but we know that that's actually a small percentage of the students with disabilities on campus. Most campuses have about 7 to 10% of their student body has some sort of a disability. But a lot of those students don't find that they actually need to work with a Disability Resource Center. We really work with students who are experiencing some kind of a barrier inside of the educational environment. And those are the only students who typically will register with us. So it's interesting when you look back at the last 10, 15 years of data of the students who've registered with us. It used to be that most of the students who worked with our office were either deaf. That's actually, our office started back in 1968 off of a grant that was to help deaf students have access here at Utah State. So most of them were either deaf, had some type of vision loss, or they used a wheelchair. And when I go and do faculty presentations, when I first started doing that, most of the time when I would ask, what do you think of when you think of a student with a disability, those were the first things that faculty would respond back with. They would think of a student who uses a wheelchair or a student who's blind or who's deaf. But you can see here, this is our current kind of percentage. And you don't have to point it out. I know you all are number people oftentimes. I know my numbers don't add up to 100%. It's a quirk inside of our database system that our counselor can not identify something, and then they just, anyways, it's a weird thing. Somehow it doesn't work out to 100%. But if you'll notice, most of the students who we work with now fall into 3 main groups. So predominantly students with learning disabilities, students with psychiatric disabilities, and let me just talk about those for just a bit. So with learning disabilities, usually we'll be thinking about a student who has a reading learning disability, a writing learning disability, a disability in math, or something that just kind of overall slows their processing speed. And so those are kind of what we talk about with learning disabilities. With psychiatric disabilities, primarily it's students with depression or generalized anxiety disorder. We don't work with students who just have some test anxiety. We'll send them over to counseling and psychological services to get a little bit of treatment for that. But if it's broader anxiety that's kind of impacting them across different areas of their life, then we'll work with students who have that. And then students with ADHD. It's been in the last few years that we see a huge increase in the number of students with psychiatric disabilities and ADHD. We notice too that as our classroom sizes get larger, right, we see more students with ADHD because the environment just impacts them differently. Even a lot of students with ADHD who didn't find that they needed any accommodations or assistance in kind of a K through 12 setting where there might be 30 students in a classroom. Once they're over in ESLC 130 and they've got 350 students and that first one stands up to turn in their test, that becomes a pretty tough environment to test in. And so we see more and more students with ADHD. And then, chronic health and then some of the more traditional things that we see. Autism is another one, just like Kimberly spoke about, that's been growing quite a bit in the number of students who register with us who have autism. So it's important to note that most of the students who have a disability who will be in your classroom are not, they don't have a disability that you're readily going to recognize. You're not going to see them walk into the classroom and think, oh, there's a student with a disability. For the most part, it's going to be what we call an invisible disability. The other thing that's really important and kind of interesting to us is that almost half of the students who we work with didn't come to college with a diagnosed disability. It's either something they've acquired while they're here or something that they've been diagnosed with for the first time. So we see that, again, quite a bit with ADHD, learning disabilities. Counseling and Psychological Services is a great resource. We have students who will come in, things are not going well in the classroom. We'll talk about that in a minute. We'll refer them over to Counseling and Psychological Services, and we'll find out that they've had a disability. Oftentimes they've struggled through school, and now that as the rigor is intensifying, they need some additional assistance. So any questions about kind of those groups or what we're seeing on campus? Okay. So one of the things that's important is knowing kind of when and how to refer a student who does have a disability. And I'm kind of front-loading what I'm going to talk about specific to students with disabilities. And as we go, I'm going to broaden it up to just creating a more inclusive classroom altogether. But as far as referring a student, you want to make sure that anytime a student discloses that they have a disability at all, that you at least make them aware of the Disability Resource Center. We can't ever require that a student come and work with our office, but anytime they disclose they have a disability, we have kind of a legal obligation to make sure that they know that there's a resource on campus that can help them. The other time, and this is often what happens more frequently, is that the student doesn't necessarily know that they have a disability, and yet you're starting to see things that would lead you to think that there might be a disability present. And a lot of times what we ask you to look for is when the input, the studying, all the things that they're doing are correct. They're putting in the right number of hours, they're doing the reading, all of those things are what you would expect from a student in your course, and they're still doing poorly. They're getting C's and D's or F's on the tests. Whenever there's that kind of a discrepancy, what we would want you to do is talk to them about our office being the place on campus that will help them figure out what's going on. So you don't need to say, hey, I think you might have a disability. Usually that's going to raise some defenses and isn't the best way to do it. But if you talk about what they're doing, give them some props for doing the right stuff, and say, I know you must be frustrated. These guys will help you figure out what's going on. Like I said, half the students we work with, that's how they're getting to our office, is off of referrals from faculty members, from academic advisors who recognize there's something going on there. Some faculty are really worried about doing that. They're worried that students are going to be upset, that a referral to the Disability Resource Center is this negative thing. For the most part, that's not our experience at all, especially for students who end up getting referred to CAPS and come back with a diagnosed disability. Oftentimes it's such a huge relief, and they're really grateful to whoever's made that referral, because they've spent years struggling in school and not knowing why, and finally having kind of this label that says, this is why. It wasn't me, I'm not lazy, I wasn't doing, just goofing off, it's because of this. And all of a sudden now there's these ways to get around some of the barriers is a really positive thing. So the other thing that we ask you to do is, of course, make sure that you have the DRC's statement inside of your syllabus. This is our new syllabus statement that we're in the process of rolling out. It's just slightly different than the one that we've used in the past. This one's currently up on our website. You can get it there. And I need to work with City. I think they've got kind of a built-in one that we can get adjusted on Canvas. The other thing that we would ask is, if you're in a face-to-face class, just be careful how you read this or how you talk about it. Again, as an interpreter on campus, I've had a chance to sit in a whole ton of classes, and it's so interesting to watch the difference in how faculty go through their syllabus that first day, and what they emphasize and what they give attention to, and just the tone of voice on different things. And it's surprising how much you can communicate, not just to students who have a disability, but to any student who's going to have some kind of a special circumstance come up during the semester about your willingness to work with them and to communicate with them. Even if you don't have a lot of flexibility, sometimes in the big classes you don't, you still want students coming to you and talking to you about what's going on, so at least you're aware. Your tone of voice and how you read these sorts of things in the syllabus make a big difference in students' willingness to come up and to talk to you. Okay. One of the things that we try to do a little bit of educating about is the difference between a historical model, the medical model of disability, and what we try and promote, which is the social model of disability. So in the old medical model, disability was seen as a deficiency. It was something that was negative. It was something that we wanted to kind of take care of, whereas in the social model, it's a difference. In the medical model, it was a negative thing. And in the social model, it's a neutral thing. Notice there, though, it's neutral. It just is. It isn't that in the social model, all of a sudden it's some wonderful thing that's to be, you know, a great positive. We'll talk about why that can be a little problematic in just a second. In the medical model, the disability resides inside of the individual. In the social model, disability resides in that interaction between the individual and the environment and in society. That becomes really important in the way you view your course and how students with disabilities, or really any student, interacts with it. As students have that kind of point of friction sometimes in a course, if we think about the course as the thing that needs to be adjusted or tweaked a little bit to reduce that friction, oftentimes we find that there's a lot more success, and especially that can carry over semester to semester. If we put all of the blame, even though some of it may sometimes reside with the student, but we can't do much to adjust how the student's going to interact with our course on an individual basis oftentimes. But if we can make little tweaks, Kimberly talked about organization, clarity of expectations, all of those sorts of things. If as you have friction with one student, you look back at the way you've created the course and make improvements there, you'll find that semester after semester you get fewer and fewer of those students who kind of have those points of friction. So the medical model looks at curing, the social model looks at removing barriers. So again, that focus on the environment. Again, this is another one that's important. We've been noticing lately, it used to be when I first started in this office, that students would come to me fairly often and they were frustrated because faculty seemed to have this real negative opinion of students with a disability or students using accommodations. I don't get that hardly ever anymore. There's some notable exceptions. We had a faculty member this year, a student brought them an accommodation form, and the faculty announced, well, if you need this accommodation, you can't be whatever that, I don't want to out the department, but you can't be whatever this profession is. They immediately marched them down to the academic advisor and asked the advisor to help them change their major. That doesn't happen hardly ever anymore. We used to get some more of that in the past. Nowadays, what we actually get students complaining just a little bit more of is this idea of going to the other end of the spectrum, where all of a sudden disability and their experience is something so unique that the professor wants to share it with the class and talk about how they've overcome challenges and things like that. That isn't the way to go either, right? In the social model, disability just is. It's a part of life. It's a natural part of diversity. And in fact, we always talk about how disability is the one minority group that you can non-voluntarily join at any minute, right? It's just kind of a natural thing. If we live long enough, most of us will end up in that group. I'm going to play just the very beginning of this.
I grew up in a very small country town in Victoria. I had a very normal, low-key kind of upbringing. I went to school, I hung out with my friends, I fought with my younger sisters. It was all very normal. And when I was 15, a member of my local community approached my parents and wanted to nominate me for a Community Achievement Award. And my parents said, that's really nice, but there's kind of one glaring problem with that. She hasn't actually achieved anything. Yeah. And they were right, you know. I went to school, I got good marks, I had a very low-key after-school job in my mum's hairdressing salon, and I spent a lot of time watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Dawson's Creek. Yeah, I know, what a contradiction. But they were right, you know, I wasn't doing anything that was out of the ordinary at all. I wasn't doing anything that could be considered an achievement if you took disability out of the equation. Years later, I was on my second teaching round in a Melbourne high school, and I was about 20 minutes into a Year 11 legal studies class when this boy put up his hand and said, "Hey miss, when are you going to start doing your speech?" And I said, "What speech?" You know, I'd been talking to them about defamation law for a good 20 minutes. And he said, you know, like your motivational speaking. You know, when people in wheelchairs come to school, they usually say, like, inspirational stuff. Yeah. It's usually in the big hall. And that's when it dawned on me. This kid had only ever experienced disabled people as objects of inspiration. We are not, you know, to this kid, and it's not his fault. I mean, that's true for many of us. You know, for lots of us, disabled people are not our teachers or our doctors or our manicurists. We're not real people. We are there to inspire. And in fact, you know, I'm sitting on this stage looking like I do in this wheelchair, and you are probably kind of expecting me to inspire you, right?
So I only share that, again, because that's what I'm hearing back from students lately. It is a little bit of this, and what's interesting is I hear it from students with disabilities, I hear it from some of our veterans, this idea that it's unique and special and that they're overcoming, that they're so courageous or whatever it is, and that that's made to be a big deal. And that almost it becomes a barrier in and of itself to just normal access inside of the classroom. Questions on kind of the social model, medical model idea at all? Okay, let's get to the kind of course stuff. So obviously Kimberly hit on some of this. As you're creating courses, the items that you're going to use, what you're going to do in your course needs to be accessible. One of the things that's most important around accessibility is recognizing what is your job to do and what is somebody else's. Because a lot of the stuff that needs to be done, city's going to help you do, or my office is going to help you do, and you don't have to do it yourself. But you have to be aware of where those areas of kind of barriers might be to tap us and to get us involved and to get us helping you out. Because if you just went online and started to do your own research about how to make your course accessible, you would burn way more time than you have given your teaching loads and your research and everything else you've got to do. So use your resources through the Disability Resource Center and through City to help you with things. But obviously, Canvas has got to be accessible. The nice thing is, compared to most other learning management systems, Canvas is quite accessible. There are ways you can break it though. So checking with your designer, having them do just a little look at it. They do a yearly audit as much as possible to kind of look for issues. But if you're making changes, if you can proactively kind of make sure that you haven't broken anything, that can be helpful. Electronic textbooks are kind of a new area of some accessibility issues. What's funny is print textbooks have always been an area of difficulty. That's the area that takes my office the most work, is converting print textbooks into audio files and things for students who are blind. But now e-textbooks have become another area where they can either do a ton to enhance accessibility, or they can be a huge barrier to accessibility. Some publishers in developing e-textbooks have taken accessibility into consideration from kind of the design phase up, and those books will be readable for a student who's blind or low vision, or for a student who has a learning disability. And the nice thing is, when they have those features built in, students who don't have a disability, who for whatever reason might want to have it read to them, can access those types of features. But it's something that you need to look at and talk to publishers about as you're adopting a new textbook. If they're selling you on the fact that a textbook has an ebook version available, just ask them about the accessibility of it. The same thing is true on some of those systems that allow for online assignments to be done. Some are built in such a way that they're accessible to students with screen readers. When I say screen reader, do people know what that is or what it means? I was going to bring an example so that you could hear it. So a student who's blind, they obviously can't see the display on the monitor. And so they're going to use a piece of software called screen reading software that's going to read to them everything that's on the computer screen. And it really changes dramatically how a student interacts with stuff that's going to be displayed from the computer. So in an e-textbook, some of those textbooks allow the screen reader to read everything that's in there. Some of them even have a little icon that you click and it'll read it internally. Others don't, and a screen reader just sees it as a blank page and that student can't access it at all. And we'll talk about that with document things in just a second, because that's what primarily, there's other reasons for it, but primarily the reason we're thinking about accessibility related to documents is for students who are either using a screen reader, that's for students who are blind, or a document reader, which is for students who have some type of a reading disability. So Word documents, PDFs, both of those need some accessibility features that we'll talk about in just a second. Captions for video. If you have a student who's deaf or hard of hearing in your class, you're going to get contacted. We're going to make sure you know how to caption things. I think Christopher's going to talk to you a little bit more about how captioning currently works. We're kind of in the transition phase on being able to do real limited amounts of captioning to where we're moving towards being able to do much more in that regard. And then transcripts for audio. The DRC can help create those. We can also get those through a vendor that City uses. So for the most part on these things, what we would ask is that you're kind of asking a couple questions as you adopt course material like books and online stuff. When you're creating Word documents, I'm going to talk to you about what you do to help make sure that those are accessible. And then everything beyond that is when you're going to tap somebody else potentially and have them help you with it. So here's a few hints that go across all kind of documents that you might be creating for your class. One is keep your software that you use for creating those things up to date. As they come out with new updates, most software packages are improving the accessibility features that are just built in, that are going to natively do a lot of what you need to do. So you're going to benefit as the university adopts new software. Make sure you're gathering or getting the new stuff that's out there. The next one is use the features inside of those software packages as they were intended. So we'll talk as we go through. I'm just going to use a Word document kind of briefly as an example. And in that, you'll see that there's ways you can misuse, whether it's tables or tab or spaces or things like that, to do things to make it look the way you want. But when you do that, it messes up how a screen reader is going to access it. And then the other one is, obviously, good design helps everybody. Don't try and cram everything into one page. And I say this because more and more often, part of what we'll do with students with disabilities is they'll come in, they're having some trouble in a class, and we'll pull up through Canvas the syllabus for the class, and we'll look at the requirements, we'll talk to them about what it is. And it's amazing to me even for my own sake, but especially for the sake of a student with a disability, how just having a little bit of space and some good organization in your syllabus, in the things that are explaining assignments, just makes such a huge difference in your ability to like read it and not feel overwhelmed by what's required of it. A lot of times in the syllabi that I'm looking at, there's so many kind of tables and datas with stuff crammed in there. It actually makes it really hard to perceive. And that also makes it very difficult oftentimes for a screen reader to make it through very dense information like that. And then the other one, Kimberly kind of touched on this with PowerPoints, give the end user, the student, as much control over the document as possible. So like she talked about, she puts up the original PowerPoints. That allows the student to then download those, and if they want to print them with 6, they can print them with 6. If they want to print them with 9, they can. If they need them to be blown up, they can use a single slide. That's true of most documents. PDF was originally created to really kind of lock documents down and not to allow much adjustment to them. There are times where you might need to do that, but whenever possible, avoid using PDFs. They have all sorts of accessibility challenges, and while you can make them accessible, it's more work than you want to. So unless you really need it to be in a PDF, don't bother doing it in a PDF. If there's a reason that you need it to be in a PDF, run it through our office and we'll help make it accessible. They keep trying to sell that they've got some good accessibility features in there. They've got this accessibility checker that walks you through some things. I'll be honest, I've been playing around with it a bunch again this week. It just does not produce a very good document at the end. We've got some better software that we can use to make sure that your PDF is actually readable and works well. So run those through our office. We're happy to do that. It only takes a few minutes, but it takes software that you don't have to do it. So whenever possible, if you can leave something in a Word document, leave it in a Word document. That allows the end user to have a lot more control over how they're going to interact with it. Okay, man, we're not going to get to any. The cheat sheets that Kimberly showed you, they're fantastic. I like the ones that are up on the web actually better. She showed you the printed versions. Those do what I just mentioned, where they cram too much into one space and they overwhelm me. If you can, go to their online version. It's really simple. It steps you through kind of the 5 most important accessibility things. The nice thing is, if you learn them in Word, they're almost exactly the same in PowerPoint. If you only hit the top 3, you will have done 98% of what you need to do to make sure your stuff is accessible. If you just put in headings, headings allow the screen reader to hear those navigation points and jump straight to them. This is important, especially if you've got a syllabus that's in Word. A lot of times, it's the assignments and the daily readings are all the way down on page 3 or page 4. If you're a screen reader user and you pull up a Word document that has no headings or anything in it, all you can do is try to jump randomly through there, listening as you go until you finally find it. By using headings and setting aside a heading for your readings and things like that, they can navigate straight to that. The same thing's true if you build it in Salsa or into Canvas, then it's got that navigation in there. So if you just do those first few, that'll make a big difference. I'm going to end there and let Christopher go.